morning Marcus Hale pulled his Tesla into the wrong driveway, he did not apologize. That was the first thing you noticed about him, the absence of apology. He stepped out of the car slowly, the way men do when they believe every room they enter has been waiting for them, adjusted his sunglasses even though the October sky was the color of old dishwater, and looked at the house the way a man looks at something he is already calculating the demolition cost of. The neighborhood was modest. Tree-lined, yes. Quiet, yes. But modest in the way that made men like Marcus Hale uncomfortable. Not because it was ugly, but because it reminded him that most of the world did not live the way he did, and that fact, for reasons he had never examined, annoyed him deeply. Daniel Croft was in the garage when he heard the footsteps on the gravel. He did not look up immediately. He was in the middle of binding a spruce top to a mahogany body, a process that required his hands to be completely still and his attention to be completely whole, and in that moment his hands and his attention belonged to the wood. He was wearing a flannel shirt with a small burn hole near the left pocket from a wood shaving that had caught a spark 3 winters ago. He had never replaced the shirt. It still fit. It still worked. That was enough. "Hey, excuse me." The voice came from the mouth of the garage. Flat. Entitled. The voice of a man who had not been told to wait in a very long time. Daniel looked up. He did not know Marcus Hale by face. He knew him by reputation, the way everyone in a 30-mile radius knew him. The man who had bought the old textile property on Route 9 and turned it into a technology campus. The man whose name appeared on the donor walls of 2 hospitals and 1 university building. The man who was apparently, according to the local paper, transforming the region. Daniel had read the article. He had used it to line the bottom of his wood-shaving bin. "You're blocking the road," Daniel said. He was not aggressive. He was simply accurate. Marcus Hale did not move. Instead, he looked past Daniel into the garage. Slowly, the way a person looks at something that has offended them without quite being able to identify why. His eyes moved across the workbench. The hanging tools. The clamps lined along the wall like soldiers. The half-finished instrument resting in its cradle. The sawdust on the floor. The single bare bulb throwing amber light across all of it. His mouth did a small, involuntary thing. Not quite a sneer, not quite a smile. Somewhere between the two. The expression of a man who has just confirmed a suspicion. "This your place?" he asked, even though he already knew. "It is," Daniel said. Marcus nodded slowly, the way men do when they are agreeing with their own internal monologue rather than anything you have actually said. He glanced back at the garage one more time. Then, as if completing a thought he had been having privately for several seconds, he said it. Casually, almost offhandedly, the way you might comment on the weather or the price of gas. "Looks like a dump." He said it with a small shrug, as though he were doing Daniel a favor by naming the obvious. As though Daniel had simply not noticed. As though 30 years of sawdust and sacrifice and sleepless nights bent over a workbench under a 40-watt bulb was something a better man would have been embarrassed by. He said it, and then he looked at his phone, already moving on, already somewhere else, already done with the small detour his wrong turn had caused him. Daniel Croft did not respond. He looked at Marcus Hale for exactly 3 seconds, long enough to see him clearly, not long enough to give him anything. Then he looked back down at the instrument on his bench. His hands returned to their position. His breathing did not change. But from the corner of the garage, from a small wooden stool near the window where she had been sitting this entire time doing her homework with a flashlight because the single overhead bulb didn't quite reach, his 9-year-old daughter Rosie looked up. She looked at the man in the driveway. Then she looked at her father's back. Straight, still, unhurried. Then she looked back down at her notebook. And she wrote something. Just a few words. In the careful, deliberate handwriting of a child who had learned, from watching her father, that the things most worth saying were worth saying slowly. She did not show anyone what she wrote. Not yet. Daniel Croft had not always lived in a house with a modest driveway and a garage that smelled of cedar and linseed oil and quiet persistence. There had been another life before this one. Not a glamorous life, not a life that would have impressed Marcus Hale or men like him, but a life that had shape and direction and a woman in it who made everything feel like it was moving toward something rather than simply moving. Her name was Claire. She had laughed loudly in movie theaters and cried at hardware store commercials and made the best terrible coffee Daniel had ever tasted. burnt at the bottom, too sweet at the top, somehow perfect in the middle. She had believed in the garage before the garage was anything. When Daniel had first shown her the workbench he wanted to build, spreading out his hand-drawn plans on the kitchen table like a man presenting architectural blueprints, she had looked at the drawings for a long time without speaking. Then she had looked at him. Then she had said, quietly and without drama, "You're going to be extraordinary at this. Not good. Not talented. Extraordinary." She had always known the exact word. Rosie had been 4 years old when Claire was diagnosed. 6 when they lost her. Daniel did not talk about those 2 years often. Not because the pain had faded, but because some things are too structural to be discussed casually, the way you do not casually discuss the foundation of a house while you are standing inside it. He had held Claire's hand through every appointment. He had learned to braid Rosie's hair in the hospital parking garage during the long afternoons, watching tutorial videos on his phone with hands that were more accustomed to chisels than hair ties, getting it wrong 6 times before he got it right. He had kept getting it right every morning after, even on the mornings when getting out of bed felt like an act of extraordinary physical courage. After Claire, the garage became something different. It had always been his workshop, the place where he disappeared on weekends to build things with his hands and come back to himself. But after Claire, it became something closer to a language, a way of saying things he could not say out loud. Grief, it turned out, needed somewhere to go. Daniel sent his into wood. He had learned the craft from his uncle, a quiet Croatian man named Bojan who had emigrated in the 1980s and set up a workshop in a Pittsburgh basement that smelled exactly the way Daniel's garage smelled now. Cedar and linseed and something older, something that had no name but felt like patience given physical form. Bojan had never been formally trained. He had learned the way all great craftsmen learn, by ruining things slowly until he understood them completely. He had made Daniel ruin things too, on purpose. "You must understand the breaking," Bojan used to say in his careful, translated English, "before you can understand the whole." Daniel had resented that lesson at 19. He had understood it completely by 41. The instruments Daniel built were not factory instruments. They were not the kind of guitars that hung on the walls of chain music stores under fluorescent lighting waiting for a teenager to play 3 chords on them. Each one took between 4 and 8 months to complete. Each one began as raw tone wood, carefully selected, carefully dried, carefully studied before a single cut was made. He would hold a piece of spruce up to the light in his garage doorway for 10 minutes sometimes, reading the grain the way a doctor reads an X-ray, looking for the story inside the wood before he committed to telling it. Every joint was hand-fitted. Every curve was shaped by eye and touch and a standard of precision that existed only inside Daniel's own understanding of what the instrument needed to be. He charged between $8,000 and $14,000 per instrument. He had a waiting list of 19 months. None of his neighbors knew this. The man at the hardware store did not know this. The parents at Rosie's school who smiled at him with that specific brand of sympathetic politeness reserved for single fathers, the smile that said, "Isn't he doing his best?" did not know this. Daniel had never told them. It had not occurred to him that he should. The work spoke or it didn't. He had no interest in speaking for it. Rosie knew. Rosie had grown up sitting on that wooden stool watching her father's hands move across with the way other children watch their parents paint or cook or garden. Absorbing it wordlessly, storing it somewhere deep, understanding it in the way children understand things before they have the vocabulary to explain what they understand. She knew her father's hands were not ordinary hands. She had always known. Marcus Hale had not been born cruel. That was the complicated truth of him, the thing that made him harder to dismiss than a simple villain, harder to hate than a man who had chosen darkness deliberately. He had been born hungry, and hunger, when it is fed long enough and well enough, when it is rewarded consistently by a world that mistakes appetite for excellence, has a way of calcifying into something that looks, from the inside, exactly like confidence, and looks, from the outside, exactly like contempt. He had grown up in a mid-sized Ohio city, the second son of a father who sold insurance and a mother who taught 3rd grade and believed, with the specific ferocity of public school teachers, that every child was capable of more than they were currently doing. Marcus had taken that belief and weaponized it. He had been the child who finished every test first and looked around to make sure everyone noticed. The teenager who chose his friends based on a quiet, unconscious calculus of usefulness. The young man who graduated business school with honors and walked into his first job already planning the job after that, and the job after that, and the eventual moment when he would no longer need to walk into anyone else's building at all. He was not without genuine ability. That was the other complicated truth. The technology campus on Route 9 was real. The 240 jobs it had created were real. The hospital wing with his name on it had genuinely saved lives, and Marcus Hale knew this, and the knowing of it had become, over the years, a kind of internal permission slip, a document he showed himself whenever he behaved in ways that required justification. I have done good things. Therefore, the other things were permissible. Therefore, the small cruelties, the careless dismissals, the words dropped like litter into other people's lives. These were acceptable losses in the ledger of a man who was, on balance, a net positive to the world. He had been married once, briefly, to a woman named Serena who had been an architect and who had left him not with anger but with a kind of tired clarity that had unsettled him more than anger would have. She had told him on the last night that he had never once been fully present in a room with her, that even when he was sitting across the dinner table he was somewhere else, calculating something, measuring something, optimizing something, and that she had spent 4 years trying to be interesting enough to bring him all the way into the room and had finally understood that the problem was not her interestingness. He had thought about that conversation more than he would ever admit to anyone. He had filed it, eventually, in the same mental folder as other things he did not intend to act on, information acknowledged, drawer closed. Now he was 53 and he was in the process of acquiring 3 properties on Daniel Street, as part of a residential development project his company had been quietly planning for 18 months. The neighborhood's modesty, which had annoyed him aesthetically on the morning he took the wrong turn, was in fact the precise quality that made it valuable to him professionally. Undervalued land. Undervalued people. It was the same equation he had been running his entire career. He had mentioned Daniel's garage to his project manager that afternoon, not maliciously, simply as a data point. "There's one on Elm with a messy garage situation," he had said, pulling up the aerial survey on his tablet. "Owner looks like a holdout type. Will need to be strategic." His project manager had nodded and made a note. Neither of them had used the word person once in the conversation. They had used the word property 11 times. What Marcus Hale did not know, what his aerial surveys and his property assessments and his 18 months of quiet strategic planning had entirely failed to capture, was that 3 weeks earlier, a 64-year-old session musician named Ray Portis had driven 4 hours from Nashville to Daniel's garage. He had knocked on the door unannounced. He had heard about Daniel's work through a luthier in Asheville who had called it. In an email Ray still had on his phone, "The closest thing to sacred I have encountered in 40 years of playing." Ray had stood in that garage for 2 hours. He had played the spruce-top mahogany instrument resting in its cradle, the same instrument Marcus Hale had glanced at and looked away from, for 45 minutes without stopping. When he finally set it down, Ray Portis had looked at Daniel Croft with the expression of a man who has just understood something he will spend the rest of his life trying to describe accurately. "How many of these have you sold?" he asked. 41, Daniel said. Ray was quiet for a moment. "Do you know where they all are?" "Every one," Daniel said. Ray Portis did not leave Daniel's garage that evening without making an offer. He had not planned to make an offer. He had driven up from Nashville with the loose intention of simply seeing the work in person, satisfying a curiosity that had been building since the Asheville luthier's email landed in his inbox 6 weeks earlier. But there are moments in a craftsman's workshop when intention dissolves completely, when you pick up something made by human hands and feel, with a clarity that bypasses every intellectual filter you possess, that you are holding the product of a life lived in complete fidelity to a single purpose. Ray Portis had been playing guitars for 51 years. He had held Martin D28s and Gibson J45s and a 1937 pre-war flat top that a collector in Austin had let him play for exactly 4 minutes in a climate-controlled room while wearing cotton gloves. He knew what great felt like. He knew, more importantly, what great felt like when it was also something else, something beyond great, something that existed in a category that the guitar industry's existing vocabulary was not quite equipped to name. Daniel's instrument was that thing. The spruce top had been aged for 11 years. Daniel had purchased the tone wood from a small supplier in British Columbia who sourced exclusively from old-growth, wind-stressed trees at high elevation, trees whose slow growth produced a grain density that translated, under the right hands, into a responsiveness that factory instruments simply could not replicate. The bracing inside the body was Daniel's own pattern. Not an X-brace, not a ladder brace, but a hybrid system he had spent 4 years developing through a process of building, testing, destroying, and rebuilding that had filled 2 entire notebooks with measurements and observations written in his small, precise handwriting. He had never published the pattern. He had never shown it to another luthier. It existed in those notebooks and in his hands and nowhere else. The neck joint was hand-fitted to a tolerance of less than 1/4 of a millimeter. Daniel checked it with a feeler gauge at 3 stages of construction and then checked it again with his fingertips, because his fingertips, after 30 years of this work, had become more reliable than most measuring instruments. The frets were leveled individually. The nut was cut from aged bone. Not synthetic, not plastic, bone, and slotted at angles calculated specifically for the string gauges the instrument was built to carry. The finish was a thin nitrocellulose lacquer applied in 11 coats over 6 weeks. Each coat sanded back before the next was added, building a surface so fine and so thin that the wood beneath it could still breathe and move and respond to temperature and humidity the way living material responds, because in Daniel's understanding wood never entirely stopped being alive, and an instrument built to last a century needed a finish that understood that. Ray had understood none of the technical specifics while he was playing it. He had understood only the result, the way the bass strings spoke from somewhere deep inside the body, unhurried and full, the way the trebles sang at a frequency that seemed to bypass the ear and arrive somewhere further in, the way the instrument responded to dynamics with a sensitivity that made him feel, for the first time in perhaps a decade, that the guitar was listening to him as much as he was listening to it. He had played 3 of his own compositions and 1 standard and then, almost involuntarily, a simple chord progression he had written at 19 years old on a cheap parlor guitar in a Knoxville apartment and had never performed publicly. Something private, something that had always lived only between himself and whatever instrument was willing to receive it. He had not planned to play it. It had simply come out, the way things come out when the instrument in your hands is honest enough to make you honest too. When he made his offer, $12,000 cash, immediate, Daniel had thanked him quietly and told him the instrument was already spoken for. A pianist in Montreal had commissioned it 14 months earlier and was due to collect it in 6 weeks. Ray had nodded slowly, the way a man nods when he respects an answer he wishes were different. He had asked to be placed on the waiting list. Daniel had written his name in a small leather notebook he kept on the upper left corner of his workbench. Ray was now 19th in line. Rosie had watched all of this from her stool by the window. She had watched Ray's face while he played, the way it changed, the way it opened, the way it shed 20 years in 45 minutes. After Ray left, she had looked at her father for a long moment. "He cried a little," she said. "In the middle part. Did you see?" "I saw," Daniel said. Rosie nodded, satisfied, and went back to her homework. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which was the day Daniel always set aside for finish work. The slow, meditative process of sanding back lacquer coats that required the most stillness, the most patience, the most complete absence of distraction. He almost didn't open it until evening. It was a legal-sized envelope with a return address he didn't recognize, a firm name, 2 surnames hyphenated together, the word associates at the end, the whole thing printed in the specific font that legal correspondence uses to signal that what is inside the envelope has been reviewed by people who bill by the hour and feel no urgency about your particular life. He set it on the corner of the workbench. He finished the fret he was working on. Then he opened it. It took him 3 readings to fully understand what he was holding. The letter informed him, in language that was technically precise and humanly evasive, that the property at his address had been identified as part of a planned residential redevelopment initiative. That a formal acquisition offer would follow within 30 days. That the offer would reflect current assessed market value, a figure that was listed in the letter and that Daniel looked at for a long time, not because the number was unfamiliar but because the gap between that number and what the garage alone represented in active commissions, in waiting list value, in the accumulated equipment and aged tone woods and irreplaceable tooling he had spent 3 decades assembling, was so vast that it existed in a different category of reality entirely. The letter mentioned in its 3rd paragraph the name of the development company. It mentioned in its 5th paragraph the name of the principal investor, Marcus Hale. Daniel set the letter down on the workbench. He stood very still for a moment, the way he stood when he was reading a piece of wood, not reacting, simply receiving. Then he walked to the garage door and stood in it and looked at the street. October again. The same dishwater sky. The oak at the end of the driveway had gone amber and copper and was dropping leaves in the slow, unhurried way that oak trees drop leaves, as though time were a resource they had no anxiety about. Daniel watched it for a while. The crisis was not simply the letter. The crisis was the arithmetic of it. He had 19 instruments on commission. The earliest delivery date was 6 weeks out. The Montreal pianist, the spruce-top mahogany body that was currently in its final finishing stages on the workbench behind him. The remaining 18 stretched across the next 19 months. Each commission had a deposit attached to it. Each deposit had been spent on tonewoods, on tooling, on the small careful expenses of a life arranged entirely around the continuation of the work. He did not have savings in the conventional sense. He had invested everything, continuously and without hesitation, back into the garage, back into the materials, back into the 19-month waiting list that was the only retirement plan he had ever trusted. If he lost the garage, not just the building but the space, the specific acoustic space he had spent years optimizing, the humidity-controlled storage room he had built himself in the back corner where $40,000 worth of aging tonewood sat in carefully labeled racks. He did not know, with any honesty, how he would continue. You could not rebuild a luthier's workshop the way you rebuilt a home office. The tooling alone represented 30 years of acquisition. The wood alone represented a decade of careful sourcing. The knowledge embedded in that specific workbench, in those specific walls, in the relationship between his hands and that particular floor under his feet, that was not a thing you relocated. That was a thing you either protected or you lost. He thought about Claire. He thought specifically about something she had said once in this very doorway, standing exactly where he was standing now, holding a cup of that terrible, beautiful coffee, looking at the workbench where he had just finished his 7th instrument. She had said, "This is the thing, you know. This is the real thing. Don't ever let anyone make you apologize for it." He had not known, standing there, that he would spend the next decade learning exactly what she meant. Rosie came into the garage at 6:15 to tell him dinner was ready. She had learned to cook simple things in the years since Claire, and Tuesday was her night, and she took it seriously. She saw the letter on the workbench. She saw her father's face. She did not ask immediately. She was her father's daughter. She read the room the way he read the wood, carefully, completely, without rushing to a conclusion. Then she picked up the letter. "Read it. Set it down." "Is that the man from the driveway?" she asked. "Yes," Daniel said. Rosie looked at the workbench, at the half-finished instrument in its cradle, at the racks of aging wood visible through the open door of the storage room, at the 41 photographs pinned to the board above the bench, one for every completed instrument, each one taken on the day of delivery, each one showing the face of the person receiving it. "Okay," she said, not defeated. Something else entirely. The word of a person who has just decided something. "Okay," Daniel said back. What happened next did not happen the way reversals happen in movies. Suddenly, dramatically, with a single phone call that changes everything in a moment of cinematic clarity. It happened the way things happen in real life, which is to say it happened in pieces, and some of the pieces were unglamorous, and the whole of it took 11 days and required Daniel to do the one thing that had always cost him the most. Ask for help. It was Rosie who started it. Not intentionally, or perhaps intentionally in the way that 9-year-olds are intentional, which is to say completely and without self-consciousness and without any of the hesitations that adults accumulate around their good instincts like sediment. The morning after the letter arrived, she had gone to school and told her music teacher, Mr. Anand, that her dad built guitars and that a man was trying to take away his workshop. She had said it the way children report facts, plainly, without editorializing, with complete confidence that the fact was sufficiently interesting to warrant the telling. Mr. Anand, who played fingerstyle guitar and had spent 15 years saving toward a handmade instrument he had always considered slightly beyond reach, had stopped what he was doing and asked Rosie 3 questions. Then he had gone home that evening and searched Daniel Croft's name online. He found very little. Daniel had no website, no social media, no professional presence of any kind. What he found instead was a single forum post on a boutique guitar collector's board from 8 months earlier in which a session musician from Nashville named Ray Portis had written, in the unguarded and slightly breathless language of a man still processing an experience, about visiting a luthier in a small garage in upstate New York and playing the finest acoustic instrument he had encountered in 5 decades of playing. Ray had not named Daniel directly. He had referred to him only as a man named D and described the location vaguely. But he had written about the instrument in specific enough technical detail that 3 members of the forum had responded asking for contact information. Ray had not provided it. He had simply written at the end of the post, "Some things should stay rare." Mr. Anand had screenshot the post and emailed it to Ray Portis directly, explaining the situation in 2 paragraphs. Ray had responded in 40 minutes. He had made 3 phone calls that evening, one to the session musician community in Nashville, one to a guitar collector in Portland who sat on the board of a craft preservation nonprofit, and one to a journalist in New York who covered American craft and makers for a publication with a readership of approximately 400,000 people. The journalist, a woman named Petra Voss who had spent 12 years writing about people who made extraordinary things in ordinary places, drove up from the city 5 days after Ray's phone call. She spent 7 hours in Daniel's garage. She brought a photographer. She asked Daniel questions for 4 of those hours in the careful, specific way of someone who understands that the best stories are the ones you excavate rather than construct. And Daniel answered them in the careful, specific way of someone who had never spoken about his work to a journalist and found, to his surprise, that he did not mind. She held each piece of aging tonewood he showed her. She watched his hands on the workbench. She photographed the 41 faces on the board above the bench, 41 people in 41 different cities, each one holding something Daniel had made, each one wearing the expression Ray Portis had worn in that garage. Rosie made them both tea without being asked and then returned to her stool and her homework, and at one point Petra looked over at her and then back at Daniel with an expression that required no words. Daniel nodded slightly. Yes, she is the reason. She is always the reason. The article ran 9 days after Petra's visit. It was titled simply "The Man in the Garage." It ran to 4,000 words and was accompanied by 11 photographs, and within 6 hours of publication, had been shared across the boutique instrument community with the velocity of something that had been waiting to be known. By the end of the first day, it had reached the desk of a heritage craft preservation attorney in Albany who specialized in exactly this kind of case. The kind where a development company attempts to acquire property whose assessed market value bears no relationship whatsoever to its actual cultural and economic significance. Marcus Hale read the article on the morning it was published. His assistant had flagged it. He read it once quickly and then, after a pause that his assistant later described as lasting nearly 3 minutes, read it again from the beginning. He did not say anything for a long time after the second reading. Then he said, quietly, to no one in particular, "Get me the file on the Elm Street property." Marcus Hale came back to the garage on a Saturday morning, 3 weeks after the article. He came alone this time, no project manager, no assistant, no legal representative. He drove himself, which was unusual enough that Daniel noticed it when the car pulled up, and he walked up the driveway without his sunglasses even though the November sky had finally broken clear and the light was the particular sharp gold of late autumn that makes everything it touches look like it has been kept specifically for this moment. Daniel was at the workbench. He was always at the workbench. He was doing the final setup on the Montreal Commission, the spruce-top mahogany instrument that had been 19 months in the making and was due to be shipped in 4 days, and he was in the stage of the process that he privately considered the most sacred, which was the final adjustment of the nut and saddle, the last small calibrations that determined how the instrument would speak for the rest of its life. He heard the footsteps. He did not look up immediately. His hands and his attention belonged to the wood. "Mr. Croft." Daniel looked up. He studied Marcus Hale's face for a moment with the same quality of attention he gave to everything. Complete, unhurried, without conclusion until the evidence was fully in. Marcus Hale looked different. Not smaller exactly, but less fortified. The particular armor that men like him wear so consistently that they forget it is armor. The posture, the timing, the calibrated ease, was slightly less complete than it had been on the October morning 6 weeks earlier. Something had shifted in the space between his face and his expression. Daniel had seen this before, though not often. It was what happened to people in the presence of the work. The specific disarmament that occurred when something made by human hands with complete fidelity was encountered by someone who had, until that moment, been measuring the world exclusively in other units. "I read the article," Marcus said. He paused. "I read it twice." Daniel nodded. Marcus was quiet for a moment, looking at the instrument on the workbench with the specific quality of attention that is different from the look he had given it 6 weeks ago. Not appraising now, not categorizing. Something more like looking at a thing you did not see the first time and are attempting to account for honestly. "I'd like to talk about the property situation," he said. "My legal team has been in contact with yours." "I understand." "They have," Daniel said. "I want you to know." Marcus stopped. Started again in a slightly different register. One that was less rehearsed, more effortful. "I said something when I was here before that I have been thinking about. What I said about your—" He gestured at the garage. "At all of it. I was not seeing it. I want you to know that I understand that now." It was not a complete apology. It was not the florid, self-flagellating admission that a lesser story would have demanded. It was a man in his 50s, at the edge of his own limitations, making the small and genuinely difficult movement toward accuracy. Daniel received it in the same spirit. Not triumphantly, not coldly. Simply, "I know," Daniel said. That was all. From her stool by the window, Rosie watched. She had her notebook open on her knee, the same notebook from 6 weeks ago, the one in which she had written something on the morning of the first visit that she had shown no one. She looked at Marcus Hale for a moment. Then she looked at her father. Then, with the careful, deliberate handwriting of a child who had learned from watching her father that the things most worth doing were worth doing completely, she finished what she had started writing 6 weeks ago. She tore the page out neatly, folded it once, walked across the garage and held it out to Daniel. He took it, unfolded it. "Read it." His face did something then. Something quiet and complete, the way a well-made instrument responds to the right hands. The way wood that has been waiting years to be understood finally meets the person who understands it. He folded the note back carefully and put it in the front pocket of his flannel shirt, close to the small burn hole that had been there since a winter 3 years ago. He did not show anyone what it said. Not that day, but that evening, after Rosie was asleep. He pinned it to the board above the workbench, between the 41st photograph and the space where the 42nd would eventually go. He stood back and looked at it for a long time in the amber light of the single bare bulb. Then he went back to work.